Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, on happiness. So, Book 10 deals with the nature of happiness and the human pursuit of happiness. This is assumed throughout the whole book, and if we recall, in the first book, the basic question was, well, what constitutes the good of human life? And that good is associated with well-being and happiness. And so in Book 10, he finally gets to answering the question. We kind of skip around, but arrive at this point. So he opens this 10th book with the following statement. Men, human beings, choose what is pleasant and avoid what is painful. Here we want to compare to his earlier statement from the first book. The good is that which all things desire. So what we have here is connection and opposition between the good and the pleasant. So this leads to some questions. For example, you find a wallet and return it to its owner. Do you do it because it's a good thing, or do you do it because you derive satisfaction or pleasure from doing it? And this leads to a basic question, an important question in ethics, is do we act for the sake of some good out there, some moral righteousness, let's say, or just because we derive pleasure from doing these things, and so we've been kind of trained for this? You'll want to see the connection here between issues that were brought up in Plato's Republic. Do we practice justice for its own sake, or for the sake of its benefits, which would be kind of like its pleasures? So you see there's a connection here in these questions. So the view that suggests that we do pursue those things only for pleasure is rooted in what's called hedonism, which we've kind of looked at before, and we'll explore it more deeply here. It's the theory that the good is just the pleasurable, and that right and wrong depend upon whether or not the outcome is pleasurable or painful. So it's a type of consequentialism, as we've seen, that what's good and bad depend upon the outcome, as above. So let's look at an early hedonistic argument. This is by Eudoxus of Cnidus. And here's the argument. All living things seek pleasure and avoid pain. This is an assumption, right? So it's not proven, but we can generally accept it that all living things seek pleasure and avoid pain. Pleasure is always sought for its own sake and for nothing else. Whatever is good is made better by the addition of pleasure. Pleasure is therefore the highest good sought by nature. Okay, so the idea is that we're starting with this assumption and we're saying pleasure adds to everything, and so it must be the highest good that's sought. So Aristotle is going to reject this, and here's his reasons behind it. First of all, he says the argument shows only that pleasure is just another kind of good. So remember, the good is that which we desire. We desire pleasure. And so Aristotle will concede this. Yes, we do desire pleasure, and we seek to avoid pain. This is obvious. But it doesn't mean that it is the only good, because he says, well, it doesn't establish that pleasure is the highest good that we seek. So now think about this in the context of life, because, well, and there's the wallet example from the previous one. Did I give back the wallet because I just wanted pleasure, or was there another good there? For example, do we seek love just for the pleasure of it, or is it that there's deeper good in actual love and friendship, etc.? So the problem here is that the second premise, this one, that pleasure is always sought for its own sake and for nothing else, is unproven, and it's a mere assumption. And so the question is, do we always seek pleasure for its own sake, or are there certain goods, right, that are different from pleasure, but that we seek them, and through it we obtain pleasure, let's say? Okay, so this is where Aristotle gives his life of wisdom argument to show that the hedonistic argument is incorrect. And here's the argument. He says, a life of pleasure is indeed both good and desirable, right? Since a life of pain is not something we want. But, he says, the life of pleasure with wisdom is better. And here you can think about why that's the case, Because let's say you're a fool who comes into the possession of lots of money, right? Suddenly you can get all these pleasures and you can go and buy cars and go on trips and spend your money, and suddenly you end up with nothing and maybe with diseases from drinking too much and engaging in all these activities, right? So, but the life with wisdom and pleasure is better than that life, because a person with wisdom would in this case order their affairs rightly so that they could obtain pleasure and continue having pleasure. So wisdom is something that is good, but it's not necessarily identified with pleasure. It's something distinct. Hence, wisdom adds something lacking to the life of pleasure. Therefore, the life of pleasure cannot be the highest good. It's a very clever argument. And it seems to overturn that hedonistic argument that we just saw in Eudoxus. So here's a clarification again. Eudoxus suggests that there's nothing but, holds that nothing but the pleasurable is the good, or there's nothing good but the pleasurable. Aristotle objects. He says, no, pleasure is just one kind of good. For example, red is one kind of color, but there's other colors. 2 is a kind of number, but there are other numbers. And so too, pleasure is a kind of good, but there's other goods. And some are better than pleasure. So there are other kinds of goods, and again, some are better than pleasure, some may be higher than pleasure. For example, love and friendship and wisdom in this particular case. So now Aristotle turns to a deeper description of what pleasure is. And he says, pleasure is that which arises upon the completion of an activity. He actually uses the Greek term, which is expressed in Latin here, but is the notion of supervenience. And the way you want to think of a supervenience, how it arises, is that, for example, a plant will grow, and when it's completed itself, from it springs forth a fruit, right? And so pleasure is like the fruit of the activity, and it arises upon its completion. That's that supervenience. And so his view here is quite naturalistic, and he's drawing from his own studies in biology. So, for example, when thirsty, we feel pain. Drinking, the activity of it, relieves it and pleasure arises or supervenes. Sexual desire, and this is a very good analogy here, especially to the plant, is desire can be painful. Intercourse, right, brings pleasure, relieves the pain, and especially in the orgasm, the pleasure arises as the fruit. Learning can also be painful. Completion of the activity can lead to pleasure, right? And learning to play music can also be painful. Pleasure arises upon mastery. Maybe as a final example, you could talk about pregnancy. That pregnancy can have its pains, and certainly childbirth does, but upon completion of it, it brings the pleasure of new life. So the pleasures of virtue and vice. So we've looked at pleasure, and Aristotle has suggested that pleasure is that which arises upon the completion of an activity. So looking at virtue and vice, we see that virtue and vice are brought about through habit, choice and habit, so through virtuous acts or vicious acts. So from these particular things, we can obtain pleasure arises. So the virtuous life, right, brings pleasure with it. In contrast, the vicious life, because you're doing vicious acts, results in pain. And this is, I think, obvious from what we've said, and here's some examples. Wisdom leads to right decision-making, which leads to success, which leads to pleasure. There's the supervenience, the fruit, which supervenes upon the completion, right? Foolishness, by contrast, leads to wrong decision-making, which leads to failure, which leads to consistent pain, right? So there we have the examples. Again, courage leads to facing fears, accomplishing what one wants, which is pleasurable. And cowardice leads to fleeing from fears, and so one is never able to accomplish what one wants, but rather fails and leads to pain. Okay? We can look at this in a social context too. Socially, the virtues are praised and they bring honor, and so there's pleasure, and contrariwise, vice leads to censure and dishonor and pain. Okay, so there's all these arguments here that he's bringing in examples to show how virtue and vice have certain pleasures that or pains that come with them. Now, what about that main question about the well-destined life? What constitutes this? How do we become happy in life? And I think from what we've seen in Aristotle thus far, the answer is obvious, that we become happy through leading a virtuous life. And so how do we do it? How do we become happy? By practicing the virtues, by being courageous, by being wise, just, temperate, etc., and also by consistently avoiding the opposite. and this should lead to happiness. And so, well, at least that's the question. But wait a minute, because we saw, well, if let's just say we just be courageous and wise and just, is that enough, right? So let's say we're constantly sick all the time. That's going to kind of hamper things. So Aristotle actually has a much broader vision in mind. He says, virtue really is the condition required and the sufficient condition without which we can't be happy. But you need all of these other pleasures and goods to be happy. So we saw that pleasure is not the highest good, right? But pleasure is still a good. So a life of pain cannot be called happy, even if it's a virtuous life. So to the life of enjoyment and the political, civil, materialistic life. In other words, having a certain amount of civil success, having some money, etc. I mean, if you're really poor all the time, it's going to make life a struggle, and it's going to be hard to be happy, okay? So they're still good, and they're still needed. So what's Aristotle's point? Again, virtue is the conditioned. To be happy, we need virtue, but the life of virtue also brings with it these other things. So first, you have to be virtuous, and through being virtuous, we can obtain all of the goods of life. And this leads to a well-destined life. So we can say, what is it that leads to a well-destined life? First, virtue, and then through virtue, obtaining all of the goods of life. Now, Aristotle's not quite done. I think maybe most of us would be done there, or at least those who are not interested in pursuing the philosophical life, as he's saying. You can also add to this that some of the religious orders and religious particular sects that developed throughout history after Aristotle's work and then begin to read this, like the Christianity and Judaism and Muslim religion, they start to see this last part as very interesting, especially theologically. We won't go into that here, but I want you to see the connection between what Aristotle says in terms of the contemplative life here and the kinds of things that you see, for example, monks in the monasteries living this life secluded in a way and sort of contemplating God. So they kind of draw this idea from Aristotle. So for Aristotle, the virtuous life is the best life. But even in the virtuous life, there can be certain activities that make it better, right? So you can think of it this way, that living a life, let's say, where you're always trying to push for something, maybe if you have to work outside all the time, it might be hard as you get older, and so maybe it'd be better to be inside. I'm not saying that this is the best, I'm saying that this could be an example. So, but what he's suggesting is that a life of contemplation and the contemplative life would make the virtuous life even better. And so what is that? He says it's the life lived in pursuit of wisdom. Now this is nothing but philosophy, because the etymological roots of philosophy are philos, which means friend or lover, and sophia, which means wisdom. So philosophy is just the love or pursuit of wisdom. So he's saying the happiest life is the philosophical life spent in the pursuit of wisdom, and here he gives some evidence in support of this. Why? Because what's proper to the human being, as opposed to all the animals, is our reasoning faculties and knowledge, that we can seek knowledge where the other animals cannot. So this must be, remember, he's a naturalist, so he's looking at the species and saying what's good for the species, and certainly all the other animals can partake in pleasure, but only the human being can really partake in knowledge and science. So that must be better for us, you see. What else? Contemplation, so thinking and knowledge and wondering and exploring new ideas, brings a pleasure that is free from pain, whereas other pleasures, for example, eating certain delicacies, can bring pain. Contemplation also brings pleasures which are marvelous. Why? Because we contemplate the origin of the universe. We contemplate the existence or possible non-existence of God. We contemplate the order of the planets. He includes not only philosophy but the sciences in this. We contemplate the diverse species that are, and these things are very marvelous to our intellect and thought. Also, we can contemplate longer than any other activity. You can think of the example of, working outside. You get tired eventually, but, thought, especially as you get practice in it, you can think all day, all until bed, and you really don't get tired. You actually build a certain endurance in it. And contemplation is self-sufficient. We need nothing but our own mind and thought for it, right? And contemplation is loved for its own sake. In other words, we want to contemplate because the knowledge is interesting. And remember that first distinction in the introduction between theoretical and practical science. Theoretical science is a science we pursue for its own sake. Mathematics, physics, metaphysics, the study of reality. So contemplation is loved for its own sake. And finally, contemplation is the result of a life of leisure. This might seem a little surprising, especially in our times, because we always feel like we should move about and work, etc. But when you kind of look at it, most people are working for that day that they might retire and live this life of leisure when they can do the things they want. The idea here is that what makes the human life the best life is pursuing the highest things, and a life of leisure is needed for this. I think for us in the 21st century, we're kind of unaware about how much leisure we actually do have compared to the past. Think of education itself, that you're being educated. Of course, many of you will have to pay for it, but still you have that time and you have the facilities to do this and the freedom to seek knowledge, and of course you've been educated all your lives. This is a certain leisure that other civilizations have not had. So at some level our society is really, from the perspective of a complete life, we certainly have things much better than many societies have had before us. And so finally, Aristotle asks this question: is the contemplative life actually attainable? Right? So we have all these practical things. We have to clothe, bathe, feed ourselves. This draws us away. I can't always be contemplating if I have to go to work, right? I suppose even if you're rich and you have nothing to do, you still have to do these things, right? And sleep, etc. Our understanding is limited. So I can only know so much at one time, and I cannot know everything. So based upon this, Aristotle expresses a doubt. And he says, look, for the human being, perfect happiness is just not attainable. Indeed, to have perfect happiness, this would be as though one were living the life of a god, right? You're perfectly happy. I mean, perfectly happy. I mean, even the concept of death, that I will die, deprives us of this. So to live a perfect life, it seems that we would have to be immortal and without any cares or concerns. And this is just the life of a god, he says. And he says, despite this, we should still pursue such a life, the happy life, right? The contemplative life. For even if we obtain but a small part, a small fraction of it, think of it, we will be better off than never having tried and attained anything at all. Okay? This applies to both individual and society, right? As individuals, we certainly should pursue this, but also as society. And when you kind of look at what a democracy is in our present times, it's kind of the attempt to bring a certain happiness for all human beings. These reflections will kind of lead us later on into utilitarianism. And for now, this is the basic idea of happiness from an Aristotelian virtue ethicist standpoint.